The moment my husband stood up at our anniversary party and asked for a divorce, everyone in the room expected me to break. That's what they thought would happen. After 40 years of marriage, after decades of building a life together, after raising a son and helping my husband build a company from the ground up, they thought I would sit there in shock, maybe cry, maybe beg him to reconsider. Instead, I smiled. And that smile changed everything. The party was being held at a quiet country club just outside Columbus, Ohio, the kind of place with tall windows overlooking a golf course and white tablecloths that always made every event feel a little more important than it really was. Robert had insisted on something big for our 40th anniversary. That alone should have been my first warning. Robert Collins was not a man who enjoyed celebrations. For most of our marriage, if I suggested a party, he would sigh and say something about how gatherings were a waste of money. Yet suddenly he wanted a full evening with catered food, a live pianist in the corner, and nearly 50 guests, friends, family, business associates. I remember standing near the entrance that evening, greeting people as they arrived, the smell of roast chicken and garlic drifting from the kitchen behind the ballroom doors. I wore a navy blue dress I had bought 2 weeks earlier, simple but elegant, with sleeves just long enough to cover the thin silver bracelet Robert had given me on our 25th anniversary. People kept saying how wonderful it was to see a couple make it 40 years. They said it like we had climbed some mountain together. Maybe we had. At the time, I believed we had. The room slowly filled with laughter, clinking glasses, and the soft music of the piano. Our son Daniel arrived with his wife Ashley, both of them dressed far more formally than necessary for a country club dinner. Ashley hugged me with that familiar politeness she always used around me, the kind that never quite reached her eyes. Daniel kissed my cheek quickly before stepping away to talk with some of Robert's colleagues from the company. I noticed something small then. Something I didn't fully understand yet. Ashley looked around the room the way people do when they already know how a night will end. Calm. Observing. Waiting. I should have recognized it. But when you've spent decades trusting someone, your mind does strange things. It explains away what it doesn't want to see. Around 7:30, the dinner service finished and guests began gathering near the front of the room. Someone tapped a glass with a fork to quiet the conversations. I turned and saw Robert standing near the center of the ballroom with a glass of champagne in his hand. For a moment I felt something close to nostalgia. Robert rarely gave speeches. He hated public attention. Yet here he was, smiling in that careful way he had learned from years of business meetings and boardrooms. The room slowly quieted. Conversations faded. Even the piano stopped. Robert lifted his glass slightly, looking around the room as if measuring the attention he had gathered. "Thank you all for coming tonight," he began, his voice steady, practiced. 40 years of marriage is quite a milestone. A few guests laughed politely. Someone clapped. I stood about 10 feet away, watching him the way a person watches a familiar scene from a favorite movie. You think you know exactly what happens next. Robert talked about our early years briefly. The small apartment we started in. The long hours at the office when he was building his construction business. The sacrifices people always talk about when they describe marriage as a partnership. I noticed Daniel watching his father carefully. Ashley stood beside him, her arms folded loosely, the faintest smile touching her lips. Then Robert paused. Not a long pause. Just long enough for the room to lean forward. But sometimes, he continued slowly, people grow in different directions. The words hung in the air like something fragile. Confusing. A few guests glanced at each other. I felt my fingers tighten slightly around the stem of my wine glass, though my hand didn't shake. Robert looked directly at me then. "Margaret," he said, using my name the way he always did when he wanted a conversation to sound formal. "After 40 years together, I think it's time we end this marriage." The room fell silent. Not the quiet of a respectful audience. The kind of silence that spreads when people suddenly realize they're witnessing something private that should never have happened in public. Someone near the back whispered something under their breath. Another guest set down a glass too quickly and the Small clink echoed across the ballroom. Daniel looked down at the floor. Ashley didn't move at all. And me? I smiled. Not because I was surprised. And not because I wasn't hurt. I smiled because, in that exact moment, I realized Robert had forgotten one very important detail about the life we had built together. A detail that would turn his carefully planned announcement into something else entirely. I took a small sip of my wine and held his gaze across the room while the guests waited for my reaction. Some people probably expected anger. Others expected tears. But I had neither of those things to give him that night. Because 2 days earlier, I had learned something that Robert clearly didn't remember. And as I stood there in the quiet ballroom, surrounded by 40 years of shared history and 50 stunned witnesses, I understood that the evening Robert believed would end our marriage was only just beginning a very different story. 2 days before the anniversary party, my phone rang just after 8 in the morning while I was standing in my kitchen pouring coffee into the same white ceramic mug I had used for years, the one with a small chip along the rim that Robert always said I should throw away but never actually replaced. The house was quiet that morning, the kind of quiet that settles into a place after decades of routine. Robert had already left for the office, something he had been doing earlier and earlier in recent months. I remember looking at the phone screen and seeing the name Michael Turner. Michael had been Robert's friend for nearly 30 years. They had started the construction company together back when Daniel was still in elementary school, working out of a small rented office with 2 desks and a coffee machine that barely worked. Michael had eventually retired and moved to Florida, but every few months he still called to check in. When I answered, his voice sounded polite at first, the way people speak when they are not sure how much they should say. He asked how I was doing. He asked about the anniversary party Robert had apparently mentioned to him. We exchanged the usual small talk for a minute or two, and then there was a pause. Not a long pause. Just long enough to feel deliberate. Michael cleared his throat softly. Before speaking again. He said, "Margaret, I hope you do not mind me asking something a little personal." I told him I did not mind at all. After 40 years of marriage, there are very few questions that still feel surprising. But the one he asked next made me set my coffee mug down on the counter. Michael asked if Robert had recently talked to me about changing any company documents. I remember laughing quietly at first because the question sounded so oddly specific. Robert handled most of the business matters himself these days. I had stepped back from daily operations years earlier, though my name still appeared on certain original paperwork from when the company was formed. I told Michael that Robert had not mentioned anything unusual. Another pause followed. This one lasted longer. I could hear the faint hum of air conditioning on Michael's end of the phone line. Finally he said something that shifted the entire morning. He said that Robert had contacted a lawyer the previous week asking questions about ownership structures and retirement transitions. Michael explained it carefully, as if he was choosing each word one piece at a time. Robert had apparently been discussing the possibility of restructuring the company before what he called a personal life change. I asked Michael what kind of personal life change Robert might be referring to. Michael hesitated again. He did not want to speculate, he said. But something about the conversation had made him uncomfortable. Not angry. Just uneasy. The kind of uneasiness that appears when someone begins rearranging things quietly without telling the people who helped build them. I stood there in the kitchen listening, watching the sunlight move slowly across the wooden floor near the back door. After 4 decades of marriage you learn to recognize certain patterns in silence. Michael eventually said something that I have thought about many times since that morning. He said, "Margaret, you were there when the company started. Your name is still connected to some of the original filings. I think it might be wise for you to look at those documents again. Not because something is wrong, but because sometimes people forget details over time." The way he said it was careful. Respectful. But the message was clear enough. After we hung up, I stood in the kitchen for a long minute without moving. I could hear the refrigerator humming quietly behind me. Outside, a delivery truck rolled slowly down the street and stopped at the neighbor's mailbox. Everything felt ordinary. Yet something about the morning had shifted slightly, like a picture frame hanging just crooked enough to notice if you looked closely. Around 10 o'clock I drove downtown to a small office building where a lawyer named Karen Whitfield had worked for nearly 20 years. Karen had handled some of the early legal paperwork when Robert and Michael formed the company decades earlier. She was a practical woman in her late 50s who preferred clear answers over dramatic speculation. When I explained why I had come in, she listened without interrupting. Then she pulled several folders from a cabinet and placed them carefully on the desk between us. The documents inside were older than I remembered. Some of them had been signed when Daniel was barely 10 years old. Karen pointed to several pages and explained how the original ownership structure had been written. At the time, Robert and Michael had focused on building the business as quickly as possible, but certain legal protections had also been included in case something unexpected ever happened to either partner. One of those protections involved the way voting shares were distributed during major life events such as retirement or divorce. Karen slid one particular page toward me and tapped the bottom corner gently with her pen. She said that according to the original agreement, a portion of the controlling interest had been placed in a trust that carried my name as the primary authority until specific conditions were met. I read the document twice before speaking. Then I asked Karen a simple question. I asked what would happen if Robert attempted to move forward with major decisions about the company without acknowledging that clause. Karen gave a small thoughtful smile, the kind lawyers use when the answer is both straightforward and slightly inconvenient for someone else. She said that legally speaking, any such decision would require my approval first. I remember leaning back in the chair slowly while that sentence settled into the room. 40 years of marriage had taught me many things about Robert Collins, but remembering paperwork had never been his strongest skill. As I drove home that afternoon, the sky over Columbus was perfectly clear. The anniversary party was still 2 days away. And for the first time in months, I began to understand why Robert had been so eager to gather everyone in one room. After leaving Karen Whitfield's office that afternoon, I did not drive home right away. Instead, I sat in my car in the small parking lot across the street, watching people walk past the tall glass windows of the building while the information I had just learned slowly settled into place. For 40 years I had believed that Robert and I built our lives side by side in equal partnership. We started with almost nothing. I still remember the first winter in that small apartment when the heater barely worked and we slept under 2 blankets while Robert sketched construction plans at the kitchen table late into the night. Back then every dollar mattered. I worked part-time at a dental office while Daniel was young, and when Robert's business finally began to grow, I helped with paperwork, payroll, and scheduling before we could afford a full office staff. Those early years were not glamorous, but they were honest. We trusted each other. At least I believed we did. As I sat there in the car 2 days before the anniversary party, I realized something that surprised even me. I was not angry. Not yet. What I felt instead was a kind of quiet clarity, the same feeling you get when you suddenly understand the ending of a story you had been reading for years without noticing the final chapter approaching. Robert had been planning something. That much was obvious now. The sudden interest in hosting a large anniversary party, the conversations with lawyers about restructuring the company, the small distance that had been growing between us during the past year. All of it formed a pattern that only became visible once you stepped far enough back to see the entire picture. I started the car and drove slowly toward home through the late afternoon traffic. Columbus in early spring has a particular kind of light, soft and golden as the sun lowers behind the rows of maple trees lining the residential streets. When I pulled into our driveway, the house looked exactly the same as it always had. The white porch railing needed repainting, something Robert had promised to do 3 summers in a row. A small wind chime hung near the door, tapping gently against itself whenever the breeze shifted. For a moment I simply sat in the driver's seat and looked at the house where I had spent most of my adult life. 40 years is a long time to share a space with another person. Every hallway carries memories. Every room holds some version of who you used to be. Inside the house the familiar quiet greeted me again. Robert would not return until early evening. That gave me several hours alone. I walked into the kitchen and placed my purse on the counter beside the chipped coffee mug from that morning. Then I opened the drawer where we kept old folders and documents that no one had touched in years. The papers Karen had shown me earlier were still clear in my mind. The original agreement between Robert and Michael had been written carefully, almost cautiously, during a time when both men understood that businesses can be unpredictable. The clause Karen pointed out placed a portion of the company's controlling authority inside a legal structure connected to my name. It had been designed as a protection in case one partner's personal life created instability for the business. At the time, Robert and Michael probably signed those pages without imagining that the clause might one day matter. Over the years the company grew larger, new attorneys became involved, and dozens of additional documents were created. Somewhere along the way Robert had likely convinced himself that the earliest paperwork no longer held real power. I opened the old drawer slowly and began sorting through the folders one by one. Some contained tax records from the early 1990s. Others held photographs Daniel had drawn on with crayons when he was small. Finally I found a thin folder with the company's original formation papers. The pages were slightly yellowed now, but the signatures at the bottom were unmistakable. Robert Collins. Michael Turner. And beneath them, my own name written in steady ink from a younger version of myself who could not have imagined the moment I would be reading them again. I placed the papers on the kitchen table and read through them carefully, line by line, the way Karen had done earlier in her office. Nothing had changed since that afternoon. The clause remained exactly where it had always been, quietly waiting for someone to remember it existed. When Robert came home that evening just after 6:00, he looked tired but unusually cheerful. He loosened his tie and placed his briefcase near the front door before stepping into the kitchen. I was standing at the sink rinsing vegetables for dinner. He asked about my day in the casual tone people use when they expect an ordinary answer. I told him it had been peaceful. I did not mention Michael's phone call. I did not mention Karen Whitfield. Robert poured himself a glass of iced tea and sat at the kitchen table, scrolling through something on his phone while the evening sunlight slipped slowly through the blinds. For a long moment I watched him from across the room and wondered how many plans he believed were already in motion. Finally he looked up and said something that almost made me smile. He said he hoped I was looking forward to the anniversary party because he believed it would be a memorable night for everyone. I dried my hands on a kitchen towel and nodded calmly. Then I said that after 40 years together, I was certain it would be unforgettable. Robert seemed pleased with that answer. He did not notice the thin folder resting quietly on the far end of the table behind him. And he did not realize that by the time the anniversary party arrived, I would already know exactly how the evening was going to unfold. I slept surprisingly well the night before the anniversary party. That alone told me something important had changed inside me. For most of my life I had been the kind of person who carried worries quietly, letting them sit in the back of my mind like unfinished chores. But once the truth becomes clear, the mind settles in a strange way. There is no longer anything left to guess. When morning arrived, the house felt almost peaceful. Sunlight slipped through the kitchen windows and stretched across the floor the same way it had every morning for decades. I made coffee, the same routine Robert and I had followed for years, measuring the grounds carefully and waiting for the quiet bubbling sound of the machine. Robert came downstairs a few minutes later wearing a light blue shirt and the same dark slacks he often wore to the office. He looked relaxed, almost cheerful. If he felt nervous about what he planned to do that evening, he hid it well. He kissed my cheek briefly as he passed the kitchen counter and poured himself a cup of coffee. The gesture was automatic, almost mechanical, the kind of small routine people repeat without thinking after many years of marriage. We spoke about ordinary things while we stood there. The weather forecast for the weekend. A new restaurant someone had recommended. Daniel and Ashley arriving early to help with the party setup. The conversation sounded exactly like the dozens of conversations we had shared during quiet mornings over the years. Only one thing had changed. I now understood what Robert believed the evening would accomplish. After breakfast he left for the office as usual. I watched his car disappear down the street through the front window, the same way I had done countless mornings before. Then I walked upstairs slowly and opened the closet where my dress for the evening hung carefully on the far side. The navy fabric looked even darker in the soft morning light. I touched the sleeve for a moment, thinking about how strange it was that something as simple as a dinner party could become the center of such an important turning point. Around noon Daniel called to confirm the schedule for the evening. His voice sounded polite but distracted. He asked whether I needed anything picked up from the bakery before they arrived at the country club. I told him everything was already arranged. There was a pause on the line, just long enough to suggest he might want to say something else. But he did not. Daniel had always been a good son, though adulthood had slowly created distance between us the way it often does. Work, marriage, responsibilities. Life becomes busy. When he mentioned that Ashley was looking forward to the celebration, I heard a certain brightness in his voice that I could not quite interpret. Perhaps he believed the evening would mark a new chapter for the family. Perhaps he had simply accepted whatever version of the story Robert had shared with him. Either way, I thanked him for calling and said I would see them later. The rest of the afternoon passed quietly. I spent some time reading in the living room, though I cannot remember a single sentence from the book. My mind kept returning to the same realization again and again. Robert believed the anniversary party would allow him to control the narrative of our marriage ending. In front of friends and family he could present his decision as something calm and reasonable. A dignified conclusion to a long relationship. People would feel sympathy for both of us, perhaps even admiration for the maturity with which we handled the situation. That was the story he expected to unfold. What he did not realize was that the original company agreement still existed exactly as it had been written decades earlier. And that detail would quietly shift the entire balance of the evening. By late afternoon I drove to the country club where the event was being held. The building stood on a gentle hill overlooking a wide stretch of green golf course that rolled into the distance like a carefully painted landscape. Staff members were already arranging tables inside the ballroom when I arrived. White tablecloths covered each table, and small glass candles were placed in the center beside simple arrangements of pale flowers. The room smelled faintly of polished wood and fresh linen. I walked slowly through the space, greeting the event coordinator and confirming a few final details about the dinner service. Everything looked beautiful. Exactly the kind of setting people expect when celebrating 40 years of marriage. Around 5:30 Daniel and Ashley arrived carrying a small box of decorations. Ashley hugged me politely and commented on how elegant the room looked. Her tone was warm but measured, as if she were watching something carefully unfold. Daniel helped the staff adjust a few chairs while Ashley and I arranged the final place cards along the tables. I noticed that she glanced toward the entrance several times, almost as though she were waiting for something specific to begin. When Robert finally walked into the ballroom shortly before the first guests arrived, he paused near the doorway and looked around the room with quiet satisfaction. The setting sun cast long golden light through the tall windows behind him. For a moment he seemed proud of the evening he had arranged. Proud of the moment he believed would bring everything to a clean conclusion. He walked over to me and asked if everything was ready. I told him it was. Our eyes met briefly, and in that instant I realized something else about the coming hours. Robert believed he understood the entire story. But the truth is that sometimes the most important details in life are the ones people forget to read carefully. And tonight, surrounded by friends, family, and 40 years of shared history, that forgotten detail was about to step quietly into the center of the room. I stood near the entrance of the ballroom as the first guests began to arrive, watching familiar faces step through the tall glass doors while the soft piano music drifted quietly across the room. People smiled when they saw me, offering warm congratulations the way friends always do when they believe they are celebrating something lasting and joyful. A couple I had known for nearly 30 years approached first, bringing a small wrapped gift and laughing about how rare it was these days to see a marriage reach 40 years. I thanked them and told them how much it meant to have everyone there. The words felt calm and steady as they left my mouth, though inside I felt as if I were observing the evening from a distance rather than standing in the middle of it. Robert moved easily through the room greeting people, shaking hands, placing one friendly hand on shoulders the way he always did in professional settings. He looked confident, almost energized by the attention. I could see that he had rehearsed this night in his mind many times. The room slowly filled with the quiet hum of conversation, the gentle clink of glasses, and the low laughter of people reconnecting after months or years apart. Daniel and Ashley stood near one of the tables speaking with two of Robert's business associates. Ashley's posture remained composed, her smile polite and measured. Every now and then her eyes drifted across the room toward Robert as if she were waiting for a particular moment she knew was coming. Dinner was served shortly after 7. The staff moved efficiently between the tables, placing plates of roasted chicken, vegetables, and warm bread in front of the guests. Candlelight flickered softly against the glass centerpieces, reflecting small circles of light across the white tablecloths. I sat beside Robert at the main table while Daniel and Ashley sat across from us. The conversation around the table remained pleasant and easy. Someone asked Robert about the company's latest project outside Cleveland. Another guest told a story about a fishing trip that had gone badly wrong the previous summer. At one point Daniel raised his glass and spoke briefly about growing up in a house where his parents had always worked hard and supported each other. His words sounded sincere, though I noticed he did not look directly at either of us for very long. I thanked him and smiled the way mothers often do when their children speak kindly about family memories. As the meal ended and the staff cleared the plates, the piano music softened again and guests began shifting their chairs toward the center of the room. I could sense the evening approaching, the moment Robert had been preparing for. The air in the ballroom seemed to settle into a quieter rhythm as conversations slowed and attention gradually turned toward the main table. Robert wiped his hands carefully with a folded napkin before placing it beside his plate. Then he reached for the champagne glass waiting near his right hand. I watched him stand slowly, adjusting the sleeve of his jacket with the same deliberate movement I had seen him use during countless business presentations over the years. The room grew quieter almost immediately. People recognized the signal that a speech was about to begin. A few late conversations faded away. Someone near the back pulled out a phone, perhaps planning to record a sentimental anniversary toast. Robert lifted his glass slightly and looked around the room, pausing just long enough to gather every eye. The expression on his face was calm and carefully controlled. He thanked everyone again for coming and spoke briefly about the importance of long friendships and shared memories. His voice carried easily across the ballroom, steady and confident. I could see several guests nodding along with his words, expecting the familiar kind of anniversary speech people often give after many years of marriage. Then his tone shifted almost imperceptibly. Robert spoke about how life sometimes takes unexpected directions. He said that people change as time passes and that honesty becomes important when those changes become too large to ignore. The words were chosen carefully, arranged the way someone arranges furniture before guests arrive. I noticed Daniel's shoulders stiffen slightly across the table. Ashley sat perfectly still beside him, her hands folded in her lap as if she had already memorized every sentence Robert was about to say. Robert finally turned toward me. His eyes met mine for a moment that seemed longer than it actually was. In that quiet pause, the entire room leaned forward without realizing it. Then he said the sentence he had been building toward all evening. He said that after 40 years together he believed it was time for us to end our marriage and move forward separately. A faint ripple of surprise moved through the guests like a breeze passing through tall grass. No one spoke. The silence that followed felt almost physical, settling across the tables and candles and polished wooden floor. I could feel dozens of eyes shifting between Robert and me, waiting to see how I would react to such a declaration delivered in front of friends, family, and business partners. Robert lowered his glass slightly, watching me with the quiet expectation of a man who believed the story of the evening belonged entirely to him. Daniel looked down at the table. Ashley's expression did not change, though I noticed a faint brightness in her eyes that had not been there earlier. For a moment I simply remained seated, holding my own glass of champagne and letting the silence stretch just a little longer than anyone expected. Then I stood slowly. The movement was calm and unhurried. I looked around the room at the faces that had gathered to celebrate what they believed was a milestone anniversary. Some looked confused. Others looked concerned. A few appeared almost embarrassed to be witnessing such a private moment unfolding so publicly. Finally I turned back to Robert. And I smiled the same quiet smile I had worn when the evening began, because I knew something he had forgotten to remember. For several seconds after Robert finished speaking, the room remained perfectly still. The silence felt heavy, the kind that settles when people realize they are witnessing a moment that was never meant to happen in front of an audience. I could see the confusion on several faces around the room. Some guests glanced down at their glasses. Others shifted slightly in their chairs, unsure whether they should look at Robert or at me. Robert continued to watch me carefully, waiting for the reaction he had imagined. I understood that expectation clearly. In his mind, the evening had followed a very specific script. He would make his announcement calmly, presenting the end of our marriage as something dignified and inevitable. I would likely react with surprise or quiet sadness. Friends would offer sympathetic words. The story would end with Robert appearing thoughtful and composed, a man simply moving forward with his life. But life rarely follows the script people rehearse in private. I held my champagne glass lightly and let my gaze move slowly across the room. 40 years of shared history had brought nearly everyone here tonight. Old neighbors. Former employees from the early days of the company. Friends who had watched Daniel grow from a quiet boy into a grown man sitting across the table from me now. Many of them looked genuinely concerned for me. I could see it in the way their shoulders leaned slightly forward, the way their expressions softened with quiet sympathy. Daniel finally lifted his eyes from the table. He looked from his father to me, clearly uncertain about what would happen next. Ashley remained very still beside him, though the faint brightness in her eyes had not disappeared. She had expected this moment to unfold exactly as Robert planned. That much was obvious now. I slowly set my glass down on the table before speaking. The simple movement drew every eye back toward me. When you allow silence to linger long enough, people begin to listen more carefully than they normally would. My voice, when it finally came, sounded calm even to my own ears. I thanked Robert for his honesty in front of our friends. I said that after 40 years of marriage, honesty was indeed something we both deserved. Several guests nodded slightly, perhaps relieved that the situation did not seem to be turning into an argument. Robert looked faintly puzzled by my tone. He had expected emotion, perhaps even resistance. Instead, he was hearing calm acceptance. I continued speaking slowly, choosing my words with the same care Robert had used during his announcement. I said that marriage is a long journey, and sometimes people do reach a point where they must decide whether to continue walking together or choose separate paths. Robert's expression softened slightly as he listened. For a moment he appeared almost reassured. Perhaps he believed I was preparing to accept his decision without protest. Then I added one small sentence that changed the direction of the entire room. I said that before we discussed what the future might look like, there was one detail I believed everyone should understand. Robert's brow tightened slightly, the first visible sign of uncertainty crossing his face that evening. Around the room, guests leaned forward again, sensing that the conversation was not ending the way they expected. I rested my hands lightly on the back of the chair beside me and looked directly at Robert. 40 years of marriage teaches you how to read the smallest expressions on another person's face. I could see him searching his memory, trying to understand what detail I might be referring to. For a brief moment he even smiled politely, perhaps assuming I meant some sentimental memory from our early years together. But the room remained quiet, waiting. I explained that 2 days earlier I had spent part of the afternoon reviewing some of the original documents connected to Robert's company. Several guests exchanged curious glances at the mention of the business. Robert's smile faded slightly. I continued calmly, describing how the company had been founded decades ago when Robert and Michael Turner were both young men with ambitious plans and very little money. Many people in the room remembered those early years. A few even laughed softly as I mentioned the tiny office where the business first operated with 2 desks and a single aging coffee machine. The memories seemed harmless enough. Robert nodded once, though I noticed his shoulders had grown slightly more rigid. Then I mentioned the legal agreement those 2 young men had signed at the beginning of their partnership. A simple document designed to protect the company during unexpected personal changes in the lives of its owners. I explained that such agreements often include safeguards that remain quietly in place for many years without anyone thinking about them again. Robert's eyes narrowed slightly as he listened now. The confidence he carried earlier had begun to shift into something more cautious. Across the table Daniel looked confused, glancing between us as if trying to piece together a conversation he had never heard before. Ashley's expression changed as well, though only slightly. Her posture remained composed, but the brightness in her eyes had turned into careful attention. Finally I said the sentence that Robert had clearly forgotten existed. I explained that according to the original formation agreement, a portion of the company's controlling authority had been placed into a legal trust many years ago. And that trust carried my name as the primary decision holder whenever certain major life events occurred. Divorce happened to be one of those events. The silence that followed felt even deeper than before. Robert stared at me for a moment without speaking. For the first time that evening, the careful plan he had arranged no longer seemed entirely certain. The silence that followed my words did not feel like the quiet from earlier in the evening. This time it was different. Heavier. More focused. People were no longer waiting for an emotional reaction. Now they were trying to understand what they had just heard. Robert remained standing with the champagne glass still in his hand, though he had stopped raising it the moment I mentioned the trust. For the first time that night his posture shifted slightly, as if the floor beneath him had moved just enough to make him reconsider where he was standing. I could see the calculation begin behind his eyes. Robert had spent his entire career solving problems quickly, adjusting plans when circumstances changed. But this was not a construction project or a business negotiation. This was a detail from the past he clearly had not expected to return. Around the room several guests exchanged glances. Some of them had known Robert and me long enough to remember the early years of the company. Others were hearing this history for the first time. Daniel looked particularly confused now. His eyes moved slowly between his father and me as if he were trying to assemble pieces of a story that had been hidden from him his entire life. Ashley leaned slightly forward in her chair. Her expression remained controlled, but the small smile she had worn earlier had completely disappeared. Robert cleared his throat once before speaking. His voice was still calm, though it carried a hint of tension that had not been there before. He said that business documents from 40 years ago were unlikely to be relevant now. He added that the company had grown far beyond its original structure and that many legal changes had been made over time. Several guests nodded politely, perhaps assuming the explanation made sense. I listened without interrupting. When Robert finished, I gave a small understanding nod as if acknowledging his point. Then I said that he was correct about one thing. The company had indeed grown far beyond what any of us imagined when it began. I mentioned the early days again briefly, describing the tiny rented office where Robert and Michael first worked side by side. A few older guests smiled at the memory. The story sounded harmless enough on the surface. But I continued speaking carefully, reminding everyone that when businesses grow quickly, the original agreements often remain in place precisely because they were written with long-term stability in mind. Robert's jaw tightened slightly. He was listening very closely now. I explained that the trust clause we signed decades earlier was not removed during later expansions of the company. In fact, it had remained quietly attached to the controlling shares that governed certain major decisions. One of those decisions involved what happened if the personal circumstances of one partner threatened to create instability for the business. I paused briefly and let the meaning settle into the room before continuing. Divorce, according to that agreement, was considered exactly the kind of circumstance that required careful review before ownership changes could occur. Daniel slowly leaned back in his chair as if the realization was beginning to reach him. Ashley's hands were now folded tightly together on the table. She had stopped looking at Robert and was watching me instead. Robert set his champagne glass down on the table beside him. The soft sound of the glass touching the tablecloth echoed in the quiet room. He said my name once, quietly but firmly. Margaret. The way he said it reminded me of the tone he used years ago when Daniel was a teenager and Robert wanted a serious conversation to end quickly. But this conversation had only just begun. I kept my voice steady and respectful. I said that none of this needed to be uncomfortable for anyone in the room. After all, Robert had chosen to share his decision publicly with our friends and family. It seemed only fair that the full context should also be understood. Several guests shifted slightly in their chairs again. No one was speaking now. The piano player in the corner had stopped playing entirely. Even the staff standing near the doorway remained still, watching the scene unfold with quiet curiosity. I explained that earlier in the week I had spoken with a lawyer who reviewed the original agreement in detail. According to that document, any restructuring of the company connected to a divorce would require approval from the trustee listed in the agreement. Then I gently reminded Robert of the name written beside that roll. My name. The words themselves were simple. I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse him of anything. I merely repeated the information exactly as it appeared on the document signed decades earlier. Robert did not respond immediately. He looked down at the table for a moment, then across the room towards several of his business associates who were watching with obvious interest. The confidence he had carried earlier in the evening had changed into something more cautious now. Daniel finally spoke, his voice uncertain as he asked his father whether what I was saying was accurate. Robert did not answer him right away. That hesitation was all the confirmation the room needed. Ashley's shoulders stiffened beside him. I could see her mind racing, trying to understand how a single forgotten clause from 40 years ago had suddenly stepped into the center of the evening. I rested my hands lightly on the back of the chair again and looked calmly at Robert. The plan he had imagined for this night was slowly unraveling in front of him, not because of anger or confrontation, but because of one small legal detail he had simply forgotten to remember. For a long moment after Daniel asked his question, no one in the room moved. The candles flickered quietly in the center of the tables, their small flames reflecting in the polished glasses and silverware. The entire ballroom seemed to hold its breath. Robert remained standing beside his chair, one hand resting lightly on the back of it as if he needed the support. His eyes shifted briefly toward Daniel, then toward me, and finally toward several of his colleagues seated near the far table. The hesitation in that single moment said more than any explanation could have. Daniel slowly looked back at me again, and I could see the realization forming in his expression. It was not anger. Not yet. It was something quieter than that. The careful understanding that sometimes the story you believed about your family was missing important pages. Robert finally straightened his jacket and spoke again, though his voice no longer carried the calm confidence it had earlier in the evening. He said that business matters were complicated and that the interpretation of old documents often depended on legal review. His words sounded reasonable on the surface, but there was a faint edge of urgency beneath them now. The room remained silent while he spoke, the way people listen when they sense that something important is unfolding in front of them. I nodded once as he finished, acknowledging that what he said was technically true. Legal documents often do require interpretation. That is why lawyers exist in the first place. Then I explained, as gently as I could, that I had already taken that step. Earlier that week I had met with Karen Whitfield, the same attorney who had helped draft several of the company's earliest agreements. Several guests glanced at each other at the mention of a lawyer's name. Robert's shoulders tightened again almost imperceptibly. I continued calmly, describing how Karen had reviewed the original formation documents and confirmed that the trust clause remained legally binding under the structure that still governed the controlling shares of the company. I did not rush the explanation. When people are listening carefully, clarity matters more than speed. I explained that according to that clause, any attempt to restructure ownership during a divorce required approval from the trustee named in the document. That trustee was still me. The meaning settled across the room slowly, like a quiet wave moving through the crowd. One of Robert's older colleagues leaned back in his chair with a thoughtful expression, as if he had suddenly remembered hearing about that clause many years earlier when the company was first organized. Daniel's face had gone pale with concentration as he tried to understand what this meant for his father's plan. Ashley's posture had grown completely rigid beside him. She was staring at the table now, her fingers clasped tightly together. Robert let out a slow breath and looked directly at me again. There was something different in his eyes now. Not anger exactly. Something closer to disbelief. He asked whether I was suggesting that he could not proceed with the divorce he had just announced. I answered calmly that he could of course pursue any personal decision he wished to make about his life. Divorce was a personal matter. But the business he believed he controlled was not entirely his to reorganize without review. That was the detail he had overlooked. I spoke the words quietly, without accusation, the way someone might explain a rule that had been written long before either of us expected it to matter. Across the room several guests shifted slightly in their seats as the full picture began to form. Robert had planned this evening carefully. He had expected the announcement to mark the beginning of a clean transition into a new chapter of his life. Instead, the moment had uncovered a piece of the past he clearly had not accounted for. Daniel finally spoke again, this time more cautiously. He asked whether this meant that any changes to the company required both of us to agree. I nodded slowly and said that according to the documents Karen reviewed, that was exactly the case whenever the specific circumstances outlined in the trust clause were triggered. Divorce was one of those circumstances. The piano player in the corner shifted slightly on his bench but did not begin playing again. Even the staff near the doors remained still, sensing that the room had become part of a conversation far larger than a simple anniversary speech. Robert ran a hand slowly across his forehead, a gesture I had seen him make during stressful negotiations many years ago when the company was still struggling to survive its first difficult contracts. But this time the situation was different. This was not a challenge that could be solved by reviewing blueprints or renegotiating a supply contract. This was a clause he had signed decades earlier and quietly forgotten. Ashley finally looked up again, her expression now carefully blank. I could almost see the calculations moving behind her eyes as she considered what this revelation might mean for the future she had imagined. The evening Robert had designed as a dramatic announcement had turned into something else entirely. Not an argument. Not a scene. Just the quiet return of a detail from the past that refused to remain forgotten. I looked around the room once more at the friends and family who had gathered to celebrate what they believed was 40 years of marriage reaching a joyful milestone. Instead, they were witnessing something far more complicated. And yet the truth had arrived calmly, without anger, without raised voices. Sometimes the most powerful changes in a story happen that way. Not with shouting or confrontation, but with a single forgotten sentence written on a piece of paper many years earlier that finally finds its moment to be remembered. Robert did not speak for a long moment after my explanation ended. The silence that settled over the ballroom felt almost reflective now rather than shocked. Earlier in the evening people had been waiting for a reaction. Now they were watching the quiet aftermath of a realization. The candles continued to flicker gently across the tables, their light dancing across glasses that no one had lifted in several minutes. Robert finally pulled out the chair beside him and sat down slowly, the movement careful and deliberate as if he were recalibrating his balance after discovering that the ground beneath him had shifted. His eyes remained fixed on the table for a moment before he looked up again, first toward Daniel and then toward me. Daniel leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the table as though he were trying to understand where the evening had turned from a celebration into a revelation about decisions made long before he was old enough to notice them. Ashley remained perfectly still beside him, though the tightness in her hands had eased just enough to suggest that she had begun reconsidering everything she believed was about to happen that night. Around the room guests exchanged quiet glances but no one interrupted the moment. After 40 years of friendship, many of them understood that what they were witnessing was not simply an argument between a husband and wife but the closing of a chapter that had been forming quietly for years. Robert cleared his throat again and spoke more softly this time. He said that perhaps the evening had become more complicated than he intended. The words sounded almost careful now, as if he were choosing them one step at a time instead of delivering a prepared speech. I nodded once in agreement. Life has a way of becoming complicated when important details are overlooked. The statement was not meant as an accusation. It was simply the truth. Robert leaned back slightly in his chair and glanced around the room at the friends and colleagues who had gathered to celebrate our anniversary. I could see him recognizing the same thing I had already realized. The story he planned to present tonight had changed shape completely. Instead of a simple announcement followed by sympathy and quiet acceptance, the evening had revealed something deeper about the foundations of the life we built together. Daniel finally spoke again, though his voice was gentler now than before. He asked whether there was any path forward that allowed everyone to step back and discuss things privately rather than in front of the entire room. His question carried the careful hope of someone who wanted to restore balance to a situation that had grown unexpectedly complex. I appreciated that instinct. Daniel had always been the kind of person who preferred calm solutions rather than dramatic conflict. I told him that conversations about the future could certainly happen later. The trust agreement did not exist to create public embarrassment. It existed to ensure that major decisions affecting the company were handled responsibly. Robert listened quietly as I spoke. The tension that had appeared in his posture earlier was slowly easing into something more thoughtful. Perhaps he was remembering the younger version of himself who signed those original papers beside Michael Turner all those years ago. Back then the agreement probably felt like nothing more than a precaution, the kind of detail young entrepreneurs include without imagining how the future might unfold. Now that forgotten precaution had returned in the most unexpected moment possible. Robert finally looked at me again, and for the first time that evening there was no performance left in his expression. No carefully planned speech. Just the recognition that the situation had become far more complex than he had expected. He gave a small nod, the kind people offer when they realize a conversation must continue another day. I understood the gesture immediately. Some endings do not happen with dramatic final words. They arrive quietly, in the calm space that follows when the truth has already been spoken. Around the room several guests began shifting slightly in their seats, sensing that the tension that had held everyone still was beginning to loosen. A few people reached for their glasses again. Someone near the back cleared their throat softly. The evening had not returned to its original purpose, but it had settled into something steadier. I picked up my champagne glass once more and looked across the room at the people who had gathered to celebrate what they believed was 40 years of shared life. In many ways that part of the story was still true. Those 40 years had happened exactly as we lived them, with all their successes, compromises, and quiet moments that only two people ever truly understand. I raised the glass slightly, not as a celebration of what Robert had announced earlier but as a simple acknowledgement of the years that had brought everyone into this room together. Robert followed the movement and lifted his own glass again after a brief pause. The gesture felt different now. Not triumphant, not defeated. Just reflective. The piano player in the corner finally began to play again, the soft melody returning to the room as conversations slowly restarted around the tables. Guests began speaking in quieter tones, their voices carrying the careful curiosity of people who knew they had witnessed something unusual but respected the dignity of those involved. Daniel leaned back in his chair with a long thoughtful breath while Ashley looked toward the window where the last light of evening had begun to fade across the golf course outside. I stood there for a moment longer before setting my glass down again and meeting Robert's eyes one final time across the table. 40 years earlier we had begun our marriage with plans neither of us could fully predict. Tonight those plans had changed direction, not through anger or confrontation but through the quiet return of a promise written long ago and simply forgotten. And sometimes that is how the most important truths in life finally make themselves heard.